The desert was burning. A storm of sand and artillery swallowed the ridgelines of Tunisia as the U.S. 1st Infantry Division pushed forward through Kasserine's scarred valley. The smell of cordite and diesel clung to the wind. Men stumbled through dust, coughing, dragging machine guns up rocky slopes under German fire. At the front, helmet low, uniform smeared in grime, stood Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. He didn't shout from the rear. He walked between foxholes, cigarette clenched in his teeth, shouting for his men to keep moving. Bullets cracked above his head, but Allen barely looked up. To the Germans, his division had become something unsettling, relentless, unpredictable, and fearless. Radio chatter among panzer units called him der schreckliche General, the terrible general. Allen's soldiers called him something similar, but with pride, Terrible Terry. In the chaos of Tunisia, amid the rubble of America's early mistakes, a legend was being carved into desert rock, one man's refusal to fight a clean war. The question was, how did he become this kind of general? When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, its army was not ready for global war. It was a small peacetime force scattered across garrisons, equipped with outdated weapons and led by officers whose last real combat experience had been in 1918. The professional corps was thin. The new recruits were raw. America had industrial might, but not yet a battle-hardened army. In those first years, the generals rising to command were still untested. They carried doctrine from training manuals, not from experience under fire. And when the Allied leadership decided to strike first in North Africa, Operation Torch, November 1942, it became the proving ground for the modern U.S. Army. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One for its crimson shoulder patch, was among the first American formations sent to fight. Its commander, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, was already an anomaly in uniform. Short, stocky, and perpetually restless, Allen had failed out of West Point once before graduating. His temperament clashed with military convention from the beginning. He was charismatic but defiant, informal but lethal in combat logic. Born in 1888 in Fort Douglas, Utah, to a career officer father, Allen grew up around the sound of bugles and parade grounds. Yet he despised parade ground soldiers. He once said he preferred men who looked like they'd been living rough to those polished for inspection. For Allen, soldiering wasn't about appearance, it was about the will to fight and survive. When America began its campaign in North Africa, this philosophy collided with institutional conservatism. The army Allen inherited had discipline problems, logistical confusion, and a shaky grasp of combined arms tactics. North Africa exposed all of it. The Germans, battle-hardened veterans of the Blitzkrieg, saw the Americans as amateurs. And in the early engagements, they were right. In late 1942, U.S. troops under inexperienced leadership met disaster at Kasserine Pass. Rommel's Afrika Korps smashed through uncoordinated American lines. Tanks were lost, communications failed, and command posts crumbled under artillery fire. The Americans retreated in disorder. The shock reverberated through Allied command. But amid the chaos, one division began to recover faster than the rest. Under Allen, the 1st Infantry Division absorbed the lessons brutally but effectively. He drilled his men in live fire maneuvers, forced small unit autonomy, and punished hesitation in combat with relentless pressure. His mantra was simple: the enemy's afraid of confusion, use it. Allen refused to command from comfort. He ate in the same rations line as his men, slept under trucks, and often appeared at the most forward positions. He rejected the notion that generals belonged in tents with maps. The British allies, more formal in manner, viewed him with suspicion. But among his soldiers, Allen's presence was magnetic. By early 1943, as the Allies regrouped for a counteroffensive in Tunisia, Allen's division had become the hammer that commanders like Omar Bradley and Eisenhower would rely on to strike back. The Big Red One was not elegant in movement, it was brutal in persistence. Allen reshaped morale through proximity. He was known to stroll into frontline foxholes during lulls, talk to privates by name, and curse at them for ducking too low under fire. The general's crazy, some said, but his men fought harder for him than for anyone else. Behind the scenes, though, his style bred tension. Superiors saw disorder where his men saw freedom. To officers trained on West Point rigidity, Allen's battlefield methods bordered on insubordination. He allowed relaxed grooming standards, tolerated soldier drinking when off duty, and encouraged improvisation over procedure. In a bureaucracy that worshipped control, Allen represented chaos made effective. That chaos was about to face its true test, because beyond the hills of Tunisia, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was still fighting with the precision of veterans. Their tanks, artillery, and coordination outmatched the Americans in every technical sense. But where discipline failed, willpower might succeed, and Allen was betting everything on that truth. By February 1943, the Tunisian campaign had turned into a grinding contest of endurance. The Germans, commanded by seasoned leaders like General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim and the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, still held much of central Tunisia. Their goal was simple: to keep the Allies bottled up in the West, delaying any move toward Europe. For the Americans, North Africa was both a battlefield and a classroom. Every mistake was paid for in blood. After Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower reorganized command, placing Omar Bradley over the Second Corps and pushing for unity with the British Eighth Army advancing from the east. But while the command structure stabilized on paper, it was men like Terry Allen who had to turn broken morale into combat power on the ground. The 1st Infantry Division, Allen's Big Red One, had already seen action in Oran and Algiers, but Tunisia was different. The terrain was jagged, the weather unforgiving. Torrential rain turned wadis into rivers of mud. Supply lines stretched thin across mountains where vehicles bogged down and soldiers went days with little food or dry shelter. The enemy knew every ridge and pass. Allen's methods adapted to the chaos. He trained his men in night movements, fast redeployments, and the art of closing with the enemy. He drilled into them the importance of momentum, never giving the Germans time to reorganize. "Fight like you mean it," he told them, and he meant it literally. Unlike many senior officers, Allen didn't delegate aggression. He directed attacks from the front, walking the lines under fire, sometimes grabbing a rifle himself to set an example. It wasn't recklessness. It was calculation. He knew that presence in the line steadied frightened men faster than any order shouted through a radio. But his approach also drew attention and criticism. Reports circulated that Allen's command posts were too close to the front. British liaisons complained about lack of formality and undue familiarity between Allen and his soldiers. Bradley respected Allen's fighting spirit but worried about his lack of polish. Patton admired his aggression but questioned his discipline. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, saw both danger and necessity in him. In the German camp, however, Allen's name carried a different weight. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Panzer officers considered the 1st Infantry Division one of the few American units capable of sustained defense. They noted the division's speed in reorganizing after Kasserine and its refusal to withdraw once engaged. Allen's tactics had given the Americans something the Germans had not expected: psychological parity. Meanwhile, the strategic stakes were immense. Control of Tunisia would decide whether the Allies could launch their invasion of Sicily, the first step into Hitler's Europe. Failure here would delay the war in the West by months, perhaps longer. Every commander knew it. In March 1943, the push toward the towns of El Guetar and Maknassi began. The Americans would face not just Rommel's armor, but also his experience. Allen's division would form the spearhead, supported by the 9th Infantry and elements of the 1st Armored. Before the assault, Allen addressed his officers with his usual bluntness. "We've been hit, beaten, and laughed at. Now it's our turn. No more running. We take the ground and keep it." There was no theatrics in his voice, only the certainty of a man who had learned to turn humiliation into fire. His soldiers believed him. They had seen him risk his life beside theirs. They trusted his instincts even when his methods seemed insane. For many, Allen's defiance symbolized the American soldier himself, unrefined, stubborn, and unpredictable, yet impossible to crush. As dawn rose over the Tunisian desert on March 23, 1943, German artillery began hammering the valleys around El Guetar. The earth shook. Tanks roared through the dust, their guns flashing like lightning. In the chaos, Allen's men held firm, waiting for his signal. It would be one of the defining battles of the North African campaign, and the moment when Terry Allen's legend was sealed in both Allied and German memory. Terry Allen was not a general who inspired fear from above. He inspired loyalty from beside. His leadership was rooted in proximity, in the shared dirt and exhaustion of the battlefield. To his men, he was not General Allen, but Terrible Terry, the man who walked the line when others stayed behind it. He made a habit of speaking to soldiers without rank in the way. No polished speeches, no rehearsed inspiration. A nod, a curse, a shove in the shoulder, that was Allen's language of command. He drank coffee with privates, cursed with sergeants, and ignored officers who saluted too often. He believed morale came from faith in the man next to you, not orders shouted from the rear. To many soldiers in the 1st Infantry Division, Allen represented the first commander who truly understood them. He demanded toughness, but he bled with them. They fought harder because they believed he would never ask of them what he wouldn't do himself. In the rigid hierarchy of the U.S. Army, that made him both beloved and dangerous. But his human approach was more than sentiment, it was strategic. By erasing the visible distance between officer and enlisted man, Allen built a cohesive fighting organism that reacted faster, held longer, and adapted under stress. In Tunisia's unforgiving desert, that difference meant survival. Allen's battlefield doctrine was not written in manuals. It was carved from necessity. He understood that the American Army of 1942-43 was not yet refined enough for textbook warfare. Instead, he built tactics around aggression, adaptability, and autonomy. His officers were encouraged to act on instinct. Platoon leaders were given freedom to exploit momentum, not wait for distant approval. This decentralized control mirrored what German commanders had mastered under the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Allen had studied their efficiency and adopted it intuitively. It gave the Big Red One a flexibility unmatched among early American divisions. He believed in striking fast and never pausing after contact. His attacks were designed to overwhelm psychologically as much as physically. "Keep moving," he'd say, "and they'll think we're stronger than we are." Even when under heavy fire, Allen's units often counterattacked instead of retreating. That constant pressure unnerved German units used to dictating tempo. He also excelled at terrain exploitation. In Tunisia, his men learned to fight with the land, not against it. Using rocky ridges for cover, digging fighting holes into slopes instead of flat ground, camouflaging positions with scraps of desert brush. These details turned raw soldiers into cunning survivors. But Allen's most decisive tactical contribution lay in his handling of combined arms under primitive conditions. When air support failed or armor coordination broke down, he improvised, redirecting artillery from forward observers on horseback radios, or moving infantry in columns shielded by smoke from burning wrecks. He treated the battlefield like an evolving puzzle, not a static plan. His unorthodox success came at a cost: chaos. Higher command, built on control and clarity, often viewed his improvisation as recklessness. Reports complained that his operations lacked orderly documentation. But on the ground, the results spoke louder. Under Allen, the 1st Division stopped retreating and started breaking through. The North African campaign was also a laboratory of weapons, and Allen's men learned through failure which tools mattered most. Early on, American M3 tanks proved inferior to German panzers. Machine guns jammed in sand, radios shorted in heat, but Allen focused on exploiting what did work. He emphasized artillery coordination and infantry fire discipline. The M2 Browning heavy machine gun, reliable even in desert dust, became the backbone of his defense lines. Mortars, especially the 81mm, were drilled to respond within seconds to target calls. Allen's insistence on cross-training crews meant that when officers fell, gunners or even drivers could take command without hesitation. His use of mobility was equally pragmatic. Half-tracks and jeeps turned his infantry into mobile skirmishers, allowing rapid repositioning across the broken desert. He believed movement itself was a weapon, the ability to confuse and reposition faster than the enemy could react. The Germans, accustomed to facing rigid Allied coordination, began reporting irregular American assaults that felt unpredictable and unrelenting. What they were experiencing was Allen's fusion of human aggression and mechanical efficiency. By mid-1943, the Big Red One had transformed from a battered formation into a functioning war machine, still rough, still unpolished, but now capable of facing Germany's veterans on near equal terms. And yet within that transformation lay the seeds of conflict. For every German officer who feared Allen's methods, there was an American superior who questioned his control. His soldiers revered him, but his peers saw a problem, a commander whose power came from devotion rather than doctrine. That tension, between the man loved by his troops and distrusted by his hierarchy, was about to define the next stage of his story. To the Germans fighting in Tunisia, the 1st Infantry Division became a name that carried weight in radio briefings. Intelligence notes from Africa Corps units began referring to Allen's division as unusually persistent. Prisoners described them as men who don't break under shell fire. Reports noted that the American infantry near El Guetar refused to disengage, even when armor support was lost. It was not the kind of fear born of panic. It was professional respect edged with caution. The Germans had crushed untested Allied formations since 1939, but Allen's troops fought like partisans, appearing where they shouldn't be, hitting hard, then digging in as if determined to die there. Captured German officers commented on Allen's speed of reorganization after losses, something rare among early U.S. formations. They realized this general did not fight by the book. His unpredictability forced Rommel to divert armor that could have been used elsewhere. The name Terrible Terry spread among panzer crews as both insult and acknowledgement. Allen's reputation among the enemy was simple. He was the kind of American who learned fast and hit back harder. And in a war where perception often preceded reality, that was as powerful as any weapon. Allen's rise coincided with a command culture still in formation. He stood between 2 generations, the old formal officers shaped by West Point decorum, and the new battlefield commanders forged by necessity. His defiance of peacetime procedure made him a natural field general, but an administrative nightmare. He clashed subtly with Omar Bradley, who valued order, discipline, and quiet control. To Bradley, Allen's informal style bordered on anarchy. To Allen, Bradley's restraint bordered on paralysis. Yet the two needed each other, one the strategist, the other the field hammer. His relationship with Patton was more volatile. Patton admired Allen's aggressiveness but despised his informality. He called Allen's men sloppy and accused him of tolerating indiscipline. Patton's doctrine valued precision, appearance, and ceremony. Allen valued none of those things. The friction between them would later determine Allen's fate in Sicily. But even Eisenhower, measured and diplomatic, grew uneasy. Command reports described Allen as highly effective in combat, but unsuitable for broader command structure. It was the paradox of his brilliance. The very traits that made him feared by the Germans made him distrusted by his own hierarchy. War reveals character in extremes, and Allen's morality of command was simple: win first, justify later. He believed clean wars were myths invented by people who never fought them. His division's methods reflected that belief: relentless, close-quarter, unromantic. Civilians often fled before his units arrived. Towns fell in ruins. The cost was secondary to momentum. He did not glorify violence, but he accepted it as the purest truth of war. He taught his soldiers that hesitation was deadlier than cruelty. That perspective clashed with the American military's public ideal of disciplined precision. Allen represented something raw, the instinct of survival weaponized into doctrine. His men mirrored that energy. Veterans of the Big Red One spoke of Allen with reverence and exhaustion. They said he demanded everything because he gave everything. He turned them from soldiers into predators. For them, the moral boundary was simple: you fight to live. But for generals above him, this realism was dangerous. It challenged the image of a controlled, moralized army. Allen blurred the line between professional soldier and fighter. His troops' rough edges, drinking, swearing, contempt for protocol, became symbols of his defiance. It was this defiance that made him legendary among his men, and suspect among his peers. Commanders could measure competence through reports and statistics, but they could not quantify devotion, and Allen's soldiers would follow him anywhere. In war, that kind of loyalty is power, and power without conformity always provokes fear. By the spring of 1943, Allen's legend had outgrown the desert. The Germans had learned his name. His soldiers swore by him. His superiors were watching him too closely. The next campaign would decide everything: whether Terrible Terry would rise as the embodiment of the American fighting spirit, or become the general his own army would quietly remove. The morning was pale and cold when the German guns began. The sun rose behind a haze of smoke as artillery shells tore through the American positions near El Guetar. The 1st Infantry Division had barely finished digging in when the first wave of Panzer V's appeared across the valley floor, gray steel shapes moving like predators through the dust. It was Allen's ultimate test. Kasserine had been a defeat born of confusion. Elgeter would be the redemption or another humiliation. The German 10th Panzer Division, experienced and well-equipped, rolled forward under perfect coordination. Their attack plan mirrored blitzkrieg: break the front, exploit the gap, destroy logistics, encircle the remnants. Against them stood Allen's Big Red One, infantry, artillery, and a thin screen of tank destroyers dug into rough defensive positions. Allen stood at his forward command post just behind the gun line. Dust swirled around his jeep. He watched through binoculars as the German armor advanced in disciplined formation. To him, the enemy looked like a machine built to crush hesitation. He knew the only answer was defiance. He didn't issue long speeches. His orders were direct. Hold the line. Don't move until you see their tracks in your sights. When the panzers came within range, American artillery opened fire. The valley erupted. Batteries of 105mm howitzers, concealed behind low ridges, hammered the advancing columns. Anti-tank gunners, many still untested, fired from foxholes so close to the line they could feel the ground shake with each explosion. The first German assault faltered under the barrage. Smoke and fire rose from burning tanks, but the second wave pressed on. Machine gun nests were overrun. Riflemen fought at bayonet distance. Allen's command jeep was hit by shrapnel, but he refused to move. He climbed atop a half-track, shouting coordinates to artillery spotters through the noise. His men saw him, helmet crooked, face streaked with dust, and steadied themselves. Fear turned to fury. Across the valley, a counterattack formed not from orders but instinct. One by one, German tanks began to fall silent, crippled by direct fire from American 75mm guns. The discipline of the Big Red One, born in Allen's relentless drills, now held the line where others might have folded. By midday, Rommel's offensive had lost its momentum. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew under punishing artillery fire. The Americans had done what few thought possible. They had stopped the Afrika Korps head-on. For Allen, the victory was not triumph, it was vindication. The unrefined discipline, the human loyalty, the faith and aggression over protocol all had worked. The Big Red One had proven that American troops could face Germany's best and win. That night, campfires burned low across the captured ridges. The men were too tired to celebrate. Allen walked among them quietly, nodding, offering a few words to wounded soldiers before collapsing onto a ration crate himself. His aides later recalled that he didn't smile or boast. He simply muttered, "Now they'll know we can fight." Elgeter broke the myth of German invincibility in North Africa. It also cemented Allen's legend. The Germans had met their match, not in numbers or weapons, but in will. But even as his name spread through the ranks, so did the unease among higher command. Reports from British officers complained of indiscipline bordering on disorder. Bradley's dispatches praised Allen's results but questioned his control. Eisenhower, balancing politics and progress, began to see a problem brewing. Allen's soldiers adored him. His victories spoke for themselves. But to his superiors, he was a general who obeyed the battlefield more than headquarters. As Tunisia fell and the Allies prepared for the next phase, the invasion of Sicily, those tensions would ignite. Because in Sicily, Terrible Terry would win again, and this time success would destroy him. The invasion of Sicily began before dawn on July 10, 1943. Allied ships blanketed the southern coast in fire as landing craft surged toward the beaches near Gela. Among the first ashore was the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, Allen's Big Red One, leading the assault for General Patton's 7th Army. The seas were rough. Waves slammed into the landing craft, flipping some, scattering men and equipment. The beach was a chaos of gunfire, smoke, and confusion. But Allen's voice came through the static of the radios, calm, deliberate, commanding. His tone steadied the men who had followed him since North Africa. They pushed inland through machine gun nests, climbing ridges of stone under mortar fire. Allen didn't wait at the shore. He was in the second wave, landing under fire, his boots sinking into wet sand as he directed engineers to clear obstacles. "Get them off the beach," he barked. "Keep moving." His presence transformed panic into momentum. Within hours, the 1st Division broke through the coastal defenses and pushed inland toward the town of Gela, where Italian and German forces regrouped for counterattack. By nightfall, the counterattack came. German armor advanced through the olive groves, their silhouettes visible against the burning horizon. American infantry, supported by naval gunfire from offshore cruisers, met them with ferocious resistance. The 1st Division held the line. When daylight returned, hundreds of German and Italian soldiers lay dead or captured. Gela was secure. For Patton, it was proof of Allied dominance. For Allen, it was another victory earned by the men who trusted him completely. But it also deepened the unease between him and his superiors. Patton demanded strict discipline, polished uniforms, immaculate camps. He believed appearance reflected morale. Allen, hardened by the desert, saw it differently. His men were filthy, bearded, and proud of it. He refused to enforce parade standards in a combat zone. "We're here to fight, not to shine," he told his staff. That attitude infuriated Patton. Clashes between the two intensified as the campaign advanced through Sicily's hills. Allen's command style, loose, instinctive, fiercely loyal to his soldiers, offended Patton's rigid sense of order. Patton accused Allen of tolerating disorder, claiming his division's camps looked like hobo jungles. Allen countered that his soldiers were too busy fighting to polish boots. But beneath the personal animosity lay something deeper, a clash of philosophies. Patton represented the institutional army, hierarchical, polished, efficient. Allen embodied the raw democratic spirit of the American soldier, chaotic, human, but fiercely effective. The two could not coexist indefinitely. By the time Palermo fell in late July, Allen's reputation among the troops was legendary, but his standing among generals had collapsed. Reports from staff officers described him as a brilliant combat leader unsuited for administrative command. Bradley, now Patton's subordinate but still cautious, supported the recommendation for Allen's relief. The order came quietly in early August. In a small field headquarters near Nicosia, Sicily, Terry Allen was informed he was being relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. His deputy, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., was removed with him. There was no ceremony, no confrontation, just a few words and then silence. Allen gathered his officers. His voice was steady, almost detached. "The division's in good hands," he said. "You keep fighting." Then he left the tent and walked out into the Sicilian sun, where the sounds of artillery still echoed faintly in the hills. His men were furious. Soldiers wept openly. Many refused to believe it. They had followed him through Tunisia and Sicily, through mud, fire, and terror. To them, Allen was more than a general. He was the reason they were still alive. But the army had decided. Patton's headquarters reported to Eisenhower that discipline and decorum had been restored. Allen himself made no public protest. He accepted the decision without appeal. But privately, he told a friend, "They want soldiers to look good dying. I wanted them to live dirty." His relief marked a turning point, not only for his career but for the U.S. Army's evolution. The institution had proven it could win battles, but it also showed that individualism, no matter how effective, would always bow to hierarchy. As Allen sailed away from Sicily, his reputation among the Germans remained intact. Reports still spoke of the aggressive commander of the 1st American Division. But in his own army, the legend of Terrible Terry now carried a shadow. His story did not end there. Another war awaited him, different front, same fire, and it would offer the chance for redemption. The 1st Infantry Division moved on without him, continuing through Sicily and into Europe. Official bulletins made no mention of the dismissal. For most of the public, Allen's name faded quietly from the headlines, but within the ranks of the Big Red One, his absence was a wound that never quite healed. Letters from soldiers described the new discipline as orderly but cold. The laughter around campfires dulled. The sense of belonging Allen had built, an unspoken brotherhood between men and command, had been replaced by procedure. The division fought well, but it no longer fought for someone. It fought because it had to. Allen, meanwhile, was reassigned to stateside duties. It was meant as an honorable transition, a polite exile. But he was not the kind of man built for staff work. His energy belonged to chaos, to the immediacy of the front. For months he remained restless, following reports from Europe, refusing invitations to social functions, turning down comfortable roles. He didn't seek vindication. He sought combat. By late 1944, the opportunity came. The U.S. Army was expanding its operations across Western Europe, and new divisions were being rushed into final training for deployment. One of them, the 104th Infantry Division, later known as the Timberwolves, needed a commanding general. Eisenhower, recognizing Allen's unique ability to shape fighting spirit, gave him another chance. When Allen arrived to inspect his new command, the soldiers expected a standard inspection parade. Instead, the general drove into camp in a muddy jeep, wearing the same battered helmet he'd carried through Africa. He ordered the men to fall in, looked at their polished boots, and growled, "You look too clean. Let's fix that." Under Allen, the Timberwolves trained not for inspection but for endurance. Night operations became routine. Live fire drills were relentless. He built an identity rooted in toughness and unity, the same formula that had made the Big Red One unbreakable. But this time he tempered it with structure, aware of what had cost him his first command. In September 1944, the 104th Division landed in France and entered combat under the First Army. Allen's return to battle was quiet, but decisive. His division advanced through Belgium, crossing the Albert Canal, taking fortified positions with remarkable precision. When winter set in, they pressed into Germany, fighting through towns under constant artillery fire and counterattack. Allen was once again at the front. He led reconnaissance patrols himself, walked the lines at night, spoke to soldiers by name. His officers reported that morale was unlike any other unit they had seen. Fearless, adaptable, steady. The Timberwolves fought through Aachen, then the Roer River, and finally toward Cologne. Allen's leadership had evolved. The wild energy of Tunisia had matured into controlled ferocity. He no longer needed to prove anything to superiors. He let performance speak. His division became known for its efficiency in night combat, a discipline so refined that even German commanders noted its precision. War correspondents began mentioning his name again. Terrible Terry had returned, not as the maverick of Africa, but as a commander whose scars had taught him restraint. The German radio intercepts that once cursed his name now reported the Timberwolves as a new elite formation. Allen's soldiers revered him as fiercely as ever. To them, he was still the general who ate their rations, shared their mud, and fought beside them. To higher command, he was proof that the Army's most unruly genius could still be harnessed for victory. By spring 1945, the 104th Division had crossed the Rhine, captured over 10,000 German prisoners, and liberated hundreds of towns. Terry Allen, the general once dismissed for defiance, had returned as one of the most effective field leaders of the war's final year. And yet beneath the triumph, a quieter truth endured. His greatness had always come from the battlefield, not the institution. The war ended in May 1945. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, and soldiers who had followed Allen through the mud of Germany now sat in silence, waiting for orders to go home. For the Timberwolves, victory brought no cheering parades, only the exhaustion of survival. Allen refused to stage a grand farewell. He moved quietly through the ranks, visiting hospitals, signing discharge papers, and shaking the hands of men who could barely stand. "You did your job," he told one lieutenant whose platoon had been wiped out outside Cologne. That's all history ever asks. It was the closest he came to sentiment. When the division returned to the United States, Allen did not seek public attention. Others, Bradley, Patton, Eisenhower, became household names. Allen faded into the margins, remembered mainly by the soldiers who had served under him. But within the Army, his record spoke with a weight of its own. 2 divisions commanded in combat, both victorious, both forged in his image. In private conversations, Eisenhower later acknowledged Allen's transformation. "He was one of the best fighting generals we had," he said. "He just had to find the right command to fit his kind of war." Yet the irony remained. The very qualities that made Allen dangerous to bureaucracy, his independence, his refusal to bow to politics, were the same ones that made him irreplaceable in combat. He represented a type of leadership that could not thrive in peacetime. After 1945, Allen stayed in the Army but never held a major combat post again. The peace that followed left little room for men like him. He oversaw training commands, wrote brief reports, attended ceremonial functions. But he never adjusted to the administrative rhythm. His world had been made of noise, motion, and chaos, and in silence he seemed to wither. Still, among the generation that followed, his name carried quiet authority. In staff colleges and lectures, younger officers studied his campaigns, his insistence on human connection, his raw understanding of morale, his disregard for appearances. To them, he was not a template but a warning, that true leadership in war often resists the systems meant to define it. By the early 1950s, Allen had retired to El Paso, Texas, near Fort Bliss. He lived modestly, occasionally visited by old comrades. Some nights he attended regimental reunions where men still called him Terrible Terry with pride. They told stories of Tunisia, Sicily, Cologne, the times when their general had led from the front, when fear turned into something sharper under his command. He rarely spoke of the war itself. When asked about his reputation, he would shrug and say, "I did what had to be done." Terry Allen died in September 1969. The news received little national attention, but among veterans of the 1st and 104th Infantry Divisions, word spread quickly. Letters poured into local newspapers recalling a man who had never asked for loyalty, but earned it. In military circles, his legacy remains complex. To strategists, he was undisciplined. To soldiers, he was immortal. His approach to leadership, personal, visceral, unbureaucratic, clashed with the Army's growing institutional order. But every man who had fought under him understood that without that chaos, without that burning defiance, many of them would not have lived to see the war's end. History tends to polish its generals into statues, stoic, clean, predictable. Terry Allen never fit that mold. His victories were not neat, his command not flawless. But he embodied something rarer, the capacity to draw out courage in ordinary men, not through ideology or charisma, but through shared hardship and visible conviction. He was the general who stood where the shells landed, the one who refused to sit in comfort while others bled, the one the Germans learned to respect not for his rank, but for the relentlessness of the troops he led. And long after the last gun fell silent, that was the memory that survived. His story does not end with medals or monuments. It ends in the dirt and smoke where he belonged among the soldiers who called him Terrible Terry and meant it as the highest praise. The war had changed the world. It had also changed him. But in the end, he remained what he had always been, a soldier who understood that leadership at its truest form is not about command, it's about presence. History remembers victory through names, medals, and strategy maps. But the real weight of war rests on the shoulders of those who command amid chaos, where every order carries a human cost. Terry de la Mesa Allen stood among that rare breed. He was not a strategist in the abstract sense. He was a field general, made of grit, imperfection, and fierce loyalty. His command style broke doctrine but built endurance. He believed that soldiers did not follow commands, they followed men. And for that reason, they followed him into the hardest fights of the war. To the Germans, he was an unpredictable force. His divisions fought with aggression and cohesion uncommon among the early American armies. To his superiors, he was a problem, brilliant in battle but difficult in peace. And to his men, he was the embodiment of leadership, the commander who slept in their trenches, who refused privileges, who turned fear into purpose. Allen's career exposes a fundamental paradox of military leadership. Bureaucracies crave order. War rewards adaptability. The qualities that make a general succeed in battle often make him unmanageable in peacetime. Terry Allen lived and died within that contradiction. He left no grand theories, no post-war memoirs, no pursuit of fame. His legacy lives instead in the fighting spirit he forged, in the big red one that held its ground at El Guetar, and in the Timberwolves who crossed into Germany at night. Those soldiers carried his lessons long after the war ended, about courage, resilience, and the quiet duty of leading from the front. In the annals of World War II, Terry Allen is neither myth nor martyr. He is something rarer, a man who refused to separate leadership from humanity. When historians speak of American generals the Germans feared, names like Patton or Bradley often dominate the conversation. Yet for the men on the front lines and for the enemy across the field, there was another name that carried equal weight. Terrible Terry, a general who never sought glory, who never forgot his men, who proved that even in a war defined by machines, logistics, and command chains, the human heart still led the fight.